Good evening, everyone. My name is Momita, welcoming you on behalf of Tell Me Your Story to the stories of floods and displacement under TMYS review September 2021. We are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems as a part of the project. Today, we are very privileged to have Professor Nandini Bhattacharya to share her experiences and views on representation of flood and victims, flood suffering message and context in global films. Dr. Suchandra Ghatak will be in conversation. Nandini Bhattacharya is a writer and professor of English at Texas A&M University. She has published three scholarly books, the latest being Hindi Cinema Repeating the Subject, Routledge 2012. Her first novel, Love's Garden, was published in October 2020. She has attended the Breadloaf Writers Workshop and been accepted for residencies at Vermont Studio Center and Bona. Her awards include first runner-up for the Los Angeles Review Plus Fiction Contest 2017-2018 and honorable mention for the Saturday Evening Post Great American Stories Contest 2021. She is currently working on Homeland Blues, her second novel about love, caste, colorism, and violent religious fundamentalism in India, and racism and xenophobia in America. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us today. We also have Dr. Suchandra Ghatak joining us. Dr. Suchandra Ghatak is a senior journalist and educator based in Kolkata. She has academic interest in literature, film, and communication. In her PhD thesis, Suchandra has explored the cultural changes influenced by the partition of India. Being a travel enthusiast, she has always preferred communicating with unknown people and explored lesser-known cultural zones. As an educator, she prefers to talk gender, age, culture, and politics with young minds. And she believes that open discussions can make a world better place. We welcome you, Dr. Ghatak. Thank you for joining us. Now I hand it over to Dr. Ghatak to kindly proceed with the session. Thank you.
Aditi.
Hello, sorry, I was having some connection issues, so wasn't letting me.
Good evening, ma'am. So we also have Aditi Thakur today. She is a sophomore at Westview High School in Portland, Oregon, and is an enthusiast for environmental science and climate change. Thank you, Aditi, for joining us. Dr. Ghatak, please proceed with the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Momita. Thank you so much. Okay, so good evening to all. And as we are here together, we will be discussing floods and global fools together with Professor Bhattacharya and Aditi. So the format that we have mutually, agreed upon is first Professor Bhattacharya and then Aditi can introduce the topic, what they have thought, what they have seen, what they want to share with us, and then we may move on to a question and answer session where, of course, I'll be moderating, and that way we can move ahead. We can we take questions? I'm sure we can. So all are welcome there as well. So I think Professor Bhattacharya, if you may proceed.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and to the friends who are here today or tonight, if it's India, and to Koral Dasgupta, Tell Me Your Story, the Environmental Humanities Center in the Netherlands for sponsoring and organizing this. I'm very honored to be here. So I'll just cut to the heart of the matter now. We're talking about floods and flood stories. And what we are going to be looking at particularly will be geopolitical, scientific, and cultural and human. consequences and implications, as well as ways of telling stories. Floods and human civilizations, of course, have a close relation. Most world cultures have a flood myth with an ending about rescue by a superhuman or supernatural agency leading to renewal and promises to do better next time. Most flood stories include an angry god or deity and a catastrophic water event that destroys the world, but is also survived by a chosen few. The name, I would say, for the intersection of such stories and geology is geomythology. So here are a few, from ancient to newer. Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, whose story is very much like the story of Noah. Greece, Zeus, the king of the gods, warning Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha about 9 days of flooding. India, Manu or the first man, visited by a fish who's actually Lord Vishnu. Christianity, Noah and the Ark. In Norse myth, the world was flooded when Odin and his brothers killed the giant Ymir with Ymir's blood. Aztec, Titlacahuan warns Note and his wife. The world starts all over again with a hearty fish and dog population. Aborigines have the frog Tidalik who flooded the world. Ojibwe, Chippewa tribes have Nanabozo and the Great Flood, where a coon saves the day. Buddhists have an elaborate flood story called Samuddavanija Jataka. In this one, people who don't keep the earth clean get washed away by a great flood. I think we can connect to that as people concerned with climate change and what we can do about it. Islam, Allah in the Quran telling Noah to build the ark. China, the Chinese flood story has a very complicated repopulation tale based on presumed incest, but they've managed to carry it off in many different ways. So, long and the short, floods carry with them both destruction and revival. There are cyclical floodings by the Nile River, the Ganges, the Yangtze River in China, without which actually those populations or those regions could not be populated and attain great civilizational heights. It seems that some flood stories are or could be based on actual events. Geologists have proposed the possibility of a great flood in the Middle East at the end of the last ice age, about 7,000 years ago. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake surrounded by farmlands. European glaciers melted and the Mediterranean Sea overflowed with a force that was 200 times greater than the Niagara Falls. There is physical evidence to support this, including Stone Age structures under the Black Sea. Other theories include tsunamis and even maybe comets that may have caused flooding. So floods have always happened, but the catastrophic level at which we can now anticipate flooding is one caused by the steady melting of the ice caps, given that in just the last 200 years, we have approximately doubled carbon emissions. This will flood about half of the Earth's land mass. Coastal areas will go underwater, and the tropics will become uninhabitable. People will migrate at a catastrophic level, with all the social, political, and other consequences of such exoduses. We seem to be headed toward creating a new flood story of our very own. Today, in particular, one of the ways in which we learn about floods and new flooding is through a slew of excellent documentaries like Fatal Flood, American Experience, directed by Chana Gazdi, Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and Ice on Fire, directed by Leila Connors. But feature films have also made an especial mark. We can categorize the latter as either unique natural disaster or progressive environmental disaster stories. In either case, there isn't much doubt that the planetary crisis of global warming is a trigger for more movies being made on the topic of flooding than before. And I'm not going to go into details of the movies, but I will mention a few that will be hopefully talked about later. Day After Tomorrow, 2004, and these are not in any particular order. This is an environmental disaster story. The Wave in Norway, 2015, a natural disaster story, even comedy, Evan Almighty, USA, 2007, an environmental disaster story, if we had to classify it. In Korea, Haeundae or Tidal Wave in 2009, maybe a natural disaster story. And who can forget Kevin Reynolds with Kevin Costner in it, Waterworld, 1995. I'd say environmental disaster. And when it comes to our own Bollywood, we have nothing less than a romantic fantasy set against the backdrop of the 5,000-year-old Indus Valley civilization itself, with painful historical inaccuracies. This is Ashutosh Gowarikar's Mohenjo-daro, 2016. We have Abhishek Kapoor's Kedarnath, 2018. No doubt there are to be many more, and global cinemas will be flooded with floods. But one somewhat offbeat example from Bollywood that carries a message not only of natural or environmental disaster, but also uplifting transnational solidarity and grassroots humanitarianism is unexpectedly the great Shah Rukh Khan's My Name is Khan, 2010. That kind of global solidarity and uniting against the fossil fuel industry is, of course, what might save us in the end from another world-ending flood. So I'll end on that positive note. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. It was lovely hearing you, and I'm sure we are going to talk a lot about representation of floods in films, how it has, if it has any effect on the popular culture, or do we need more of flood films? But before we go into such discussions, I would love to invite Aditi to share a bit of her observations on flood-based films. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. That was a really wonderful introduction speech. So I would like to start by saying, growing up, I had always heard about the impacts that floods had throughout not only the world, but my own family, given that my grandparents lived in the region of Bihar. So, I would hear continuous stories about how, floods would come and disrupt the very way of their life and the society there. Now, with the assistance of Professor Bhattacharya, I was able to gain a deeper insight about how deeply ingrained they are, not just in our society, in our stories, in our things such as Indian mythology, but also through our very current films, books, and literature that is prevalent to this day. And some examples, like Professor Bhattacharya gave, were feature films, such as The Day After Tomorrow, An Inconvenient Truth, and by Al Gore, in which the classic, a hero would come and save its citizens from a flood. But you also have things such as documentaries analyzing the effects of floods and why they're there, main cause being climate change. And it gives you a deeper insight of how this issue currently is affecting millions around the globe. And then you come to things such as literature. And you have the very famous The Flood by Stephen Baxter. And I'm specifically talking about Volume 1. But nominated, for a British Science Fiction Award, it talks about how in a near future world, a flood completely destroys the entire globe and how it impacts human civilization for decades to come. Now, this is not just a fictional book, but could end up being our very reality, as Professor Bhattacharya talked about. And, this research sort of expedition, if you will, has taught me a lot about how this issue of floods, if you will, starting from things such as, the Das Avatar, in which Lord Vishnu causes a huge flood to take over the world and then comes in the form of a fish to save his devotees, to things such as current books, The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood, and documentaries by Leonardo DiCaprio, before the flood, all have a huge impact on today's youth, and hopefully is enough to advise us on the current climate change crisis and the floods that are caused because of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, it actually is lovely, listening to you, Aditi, with the way you mention this avatar and how you connect of flood with mythology that Professor Bhattacharya introduced to us first. Before getting into the mythology and the connection of geology in just not in flood, but in popular culture, in literature as well. We have seen flood episodes in different places, cited in different literary texts, religious texts, Professor Bhattacharya mentioned. And I was just, thinking, how do you think, is it more like, has so many flood really happened, or the flood stories actually traveled with the immigrants as they migrated from one place to another? How would you, just look into it, maybe?
Aditi, you want to take it, or I can speak to it also?
You go ahead, Professor.
Thank you. I think that some of these geographical areas being contingent, they may have in fact experienced these massive floods, world-ending floods. And I am no geologist, so if I'm misstating something, I'm willing to stand corrected. But that's my sense. But it's a wonderful question, actually, and I had not thought about, that there is maybe a kind of archetype of a great flood in our minds. I don't know, I'm just kind of wildly guessing there, that could travel from culture to culture, just as a story. And yes, when people migrate, as migrations have always happened, they're not new, they may be carrying stories from their original cultures to other places. I think in some ways, what would be really interesting to know is what causes the variations, So we could maybe look at that a little bit more. So we have in a number of stories, human rescuers or human survivors. But then in some other cultures, we seem to see humans playing very little, a very small role in the rescue and the revival process. In fact, in one of them, I think it's the Ojibwe story, the humans just disgrace themselves to such an extent that actually at the end there are no humans, and we don't really know when they will come back. But there are a lot of fish and a couple of dogs. And in other cultures, the coon is the rescuer. It may be interesting to look at why there are such differences. And what is it about maybe the culture itself that doesn't put human at the center, even though in our case, of course, we are the major agents in climate change and now global threats of flooding. But in certain other cultures, as I just said, humans are not at the center. These are not anthropocentric stories. These are about nature. These are about the connections between life forms, symbiotic existence, coexistence on a planet that we all inhabit, not just us humans. So I don't really know if that answers your question at all. I think it doesn't, but I do think that the variations in the stories are very telling, very interesting, and that may be why I wonder if they are in fact just versions of the same story, because the actors change, and the actors very much come out of, it seems to me, the mythology or geomythological context. So for the Ojibwe, for the Native American, for the Aborigine, we have the frog, the coon, the dogs, and the fish. In the biblical version, in the very highly religious versions, the well-known world religion versions in Hinduism, to some extent, maybe not so much the Buddhist one, but in these other versions, humans are doing it all. Like, we are the saviors, we are the, so I just think that's interesting, and I think that may be a reason to think that these stories, the floods may or may not have happened, but these stories do have somewhat local origins. Aditi, if you want to add to that. I don't know if I answered the question.
No, I was about to go on the same track, but when I saw Professor Bhattacharya's list of, ancient tales of floods, I never realized how many of the different, cultures and religions around the world had that same prevalent story of this major flood. And, growing up, like I said, I learned about the Dasavatar, and I knew about major floods in Islam and Christianity. And personally, I do believe that there was that one huge flood that impacted human society to an extent where that story has spread all over the world. But perhaps along the way, it just, got its own bits and pieces of different, cultures, different values, different opinions. And I think people also took religious meaning to that as well. People who were saved took some sort of a religious meaning. Obviously, I don't know about the different time periods of these floods. Maybe there was an issue in when and where they happened in the stories. But I think if we think about it like logically, maybe there was that one big flood that while traveling throughout the globe, the news of it and, the idea of what it was got attached to different cultures, different religions, got its own meaning, its own values, and, that in its own way affected human society.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, deviate a bit. Actually, am I audible, Elena? I'm not sure, because well, as we discuss nature and its impact on human agency, we had a very stormy evening here, and the internet connection is disturbing me a bit, and at times, Aditi, I'm sorry, but at times I see that you're not completely very clearly audible to me. I don't know if it's the case with everyone, but Professor Bhattacharya, can you hear Aditi well? And I think it is.
I'm hearing Aditi clearly. You are sometimes kind of, fading out and then coming back in. And then some people, I think maybe the audience says they can hear things. So, So Coral just wrote in the chat that she can hear you. So no worries.
Thank you so much. Actually, I was worried. Okay, so yeah, as you know, Aditi, thank you for the wonderful reflection. Though as Professor Bhattacharya was saying that if that answers my question, actually it answers my question, Professor Bhattacharya. I really wanted to, ask you how you connect the flood stories. And of course, that is a personal way of connecting it, because when you were mentioning, and then later Aditi mentioned the religious flood stories as well. And if we go back to, say the flood episode of Bible, and then we say we connect the episode on Das Avatar. Yeah. And you mentioned that at the end, it's just dogs or some animals that are remaining, and this is I think it is not just a case of flood, though we see that especially the ancient texts mostly, mention flood as the most disastrous natural calamity that, you know, where human agency fails. Now we know there are many other things. We are struggling with so many other things now, but what I wanted to, you know, go and get into is actually how we relate, you know, as Professor Bhattacharya and Aditi both. How would you relate to the metaphor of flood in the, you know, how it has, would you say how it has traveled across culture, the metaphor as in, and why right today we are discussing its cinematic representation. We are of course we have always, you know, discussed its literary representation, but for that we need, you know, it what made flood that big, you know, it followed from one culture to another, or you know, the making of the metaphor that is of flood. How
Yeah,
would you react to that?
that's a great question, and I'll just say my piece first, and I hope Aditi will add something. Um, I think I really like the sort of naming it a metaphor. And indeed, you point out that in geomythologies, the common phenomenon is flood, not volcanic eruption, not a comet striking the earth. Those don't seem to exist. We seem to, though, have a story of flooding that has many common points across cultures, which we can imagine because the Mesopotamian civilization was at least 5,000 years old, that it very well could have it could have very well been derived from a real geological flooding that happened, say, 10 to 7,000 years ago for us. So that would be like, 2,000, 3,000 years before for them. And so, again, this being the Middle East, of course, Christianity also has its cradle there, Islam has its cradle there. And so they may have, in fact, also picked up the same story about the real flood that happened. And the Black Sea just gradually came up or just flooded over, not sure how that happens, and submerged cities. Of course, we also have the myth of Atlantis, which, I didn't mention, but that's there. So how does the metaphor get generated? First of all, I do think there is this kind of sense of a real sort of unescapable catastrophe that a flood is, that you can just not get away. Fires may spread more slowly. Volcanic earthquakes may happen, but you may not be directly, right in the middle or in the way of it. But if a great flood is coming, or if there's a tsunami or a great wall of water, you don't get away. So I think that that being said, that there is this one great flood. It's interesting to see, as I said before, how the stories are different. So, for instance, I was thinking about this as you were speaking. In the Jataka story, the Buddhist story, I like that story a lot because it specifically says it was more detailed. It was it's based in the context. The setting is a village where there's a lot of criminal activity going on before the flooding happens, and the sort of general morale and moral tone is not very high. And then people start doing things like defecating on in the fields, on the streets, or wherever, and not bothering to clear up. And that, in the end, is, as far as I know, the reason for the flood. Now, there again, I do think that one other aspect of flood, which is the revival aspect, which is the cleansing aspect, may also have a part to play. I don't know. Like when you think about, water, it can kill you, but it can clean. It can, like in the Nile and the Ganges, it can actually make agriculture possible. It can enrich the soil when it withdraws, especially if it's a slow process. So maybe some of the metaphoric quality of it comes from this feeling that we need to have, to not, pardon my French, but to have shit cleaned away from the earth. And it is not something we as humans have been able to do. And so it falls upon a natural, a great environmental or cosmic force to do it for us. So, and then we can, in fact, survive and we can recover. In the Bible, it's because of sin. In the Vedas or in the Hindu texts, it's because of sin. So in the religious stories, it gets, I think, more of this kind of moral science kind of shape. But even if it's not a religious story, I think it may reflect some of the need that maybe these cultures at different points felt for, just like changing how things are, how badly, we have in fact managed. And of course, those people managed, the world, the earth, nothing like as badly as we have. I mean, in 200 years, we have just increased carbon emissions to an unbelievable. We're at the tipping point, or very close to the tipping point. We may not be able to get back if we don't do something. We will not be able to get back if we don't do something right now. So we've done far worse. And in that sense, what do we feel now? Like when we think about floods and flooding, we go back to the old stories. And we go back to the, maybe the lessons immanent in them. The lessons are different in different cultures. In some places, it's a very human story with the morality issue and the sin issue. I mean, the Ojibwe and some of the other ones, the Aboriginal version, they don't have a moral compass. At least that's not a big part of the story. It's kind of like, this happened. But the religious stories you see, or the scriptural versions, all have this kind of judgmental, and then there's the great deity who comes. The Native American and the Aboriginal and some of the other stories, there's no deity. It's just all between living things and nature. So I think that I'm basically trying to say that maybe sometimes we wish a flood would come, and it would save us, because we can't get rid of these people who are burning, fossil fuel, who are littering the earth, who are causing environmental pollution. And there's not a lot we don't have deities. I guess we have political leaders, but they don't have the power to just wipe things off with one great slap of water. So my very rambling answer to your very good question.
That was a wonderful rambling, actually. You mentioned the cleansing effect and the cleansing elements of flood stories. And also, in fact, I really wanted to come into the educational effect of it first. Well, you clearly pointed out that the religious stories, those stories have more moral elements, which the folklores, if we hold them to be so, are more documentary in nature. From there, actually, I would like to move into one question, that is, how would you compare the films now? You have when in your initial speech, you mentioned flood-based documentaries, as well as you mentioned some feature films. So how would you actually compare the educational elements of these two categories? I would say.
I'm going to ask Aditi to speak, because she did a lot of the research on the documentaries and some of the literature. So if you want to start, Aditi, that would be great.
So, obviously the documentaries and feature films had some level of educational impact, but obviously you can contribute more of that to documentaries. Obviously they were based on, like I talked about, Leonardo DiCaprio's After the Flood, and his various different obviously other films that I didn't research, but we know about his documentaries on promoting the issue of climate change and finding ways to educate people on that on platforms such as Hulu and Netflix and the internet, essentially. And then you have feature films that include aspects of floods, like, Bollywood films. Now, I don't necessarily think filmmakers intentionally put those in to, educate people. I think it's more of a dramatic effect to somehow make the story even more dramatic than it already is in Bollywood. But I think I find them most prevalent throughout documentaries. I think documentaries are perhaps the best way for educational impact throughout, regarding the issues of floods, if you will, and I think some of the best kinds of documentaries are the ones that are sort of shaped like a story, because I think people find a way to enjoy those stories along the way. I found that some of the documentaries I watched throughout my research process, a lot of them were shaped like a story with a beginning, a middle, and end, but still with the purpose of education, and I think things like that really reach people because people like stories. They like, and we've seen, with mythological stories, with religious stories, with cultural stories about floods, people like stories. And if you take a documentary and you add a story into it, it's sort of weaving the two paths. It's not just a standalone, boring educational film and not just a dramatic Bollywood film. Then you have literature. And literature obviously dates back way before, a film. And I think even in literature is obviously inspired, I find inspired by culture, inspired by people. And you have books about floods in where my family lives. And there's a common saying in Hindi, because we have, obviously the books are based on religious floods, causes of, like Professor Bhattacharya talked about, causes of God coming down and cleansing the earth. And my grandparents, they like to say this in Hindi, जब दुनिया में पाप बढ़ता है तो भगवान किसी न किसी तरह दुनिया को साफ करते हैं. And I think that's just one way of them saying that, these floods are coming from a religious standpoint. And you can see that in multiple books, that people will find a way to say, okay, yeah, this is because of God, and sometimes it can go to an extent of them blaming it completely on God. I read a book about that, actually. It was a while back. I don't remember the name, but them blaming this issue in the tiny aspect of the book on the complete issue of the flood on God. When if we look at it, a lot of these natural disasters are caused by human civilization itself. And, some of the books that I researched talked about the supposed near future in which a flood completely decimates the flood, the main climatic horrible natural disaster of climate change, the one people are truly the most terrified of in that story. And right now, the flood completely decimating human civilization and people basically living off of what they have done, living off of paying for what they have done, destroying nature. And I think it's a really cool way to sort of see how the books found a subtle way to show the readers that, hey, this is going to happen. Maybe it wasn't the most educational thing, clearly writing out facts about floods and how they impact human civilization, but sort of a subtle way of saying, this is what can happen. This is truly how horrific it can get. So, think about this issue, and then, it's just a slightly different way from films, but still impactful in, people's lives.
I completely agree with Aditi that, there is this kind of stories work much better. And so anything that is told as a story with protagonists and villains is much more impactful. I'm saying this sort of on a limb because I'm just thinking it, but I think the flood stories are so interesting because they're more complicated than assigning agency specifically to one kind of one species, one kind of animal, one kind of thing, and so the overall intervention by a deity is maybe necessary for that reason, because they just don't give us a great deal of someone to blame. I do want to quickly say, and I also really enjoyed reading and watching the films that Aditi suggested, all of the documentaries, some of the feature films. But I'll just quickly go over maybe some of the other ones, the really sort of, crass commercial films. Let's see what those stories say, just briefly. So for instance, in Day After Tomorrow, so a father, Dennis Quaid, has problems with his son who lives with his ex-wife. He feels like he hasn't spent enough time with his son. He's a scientist who studied weather patterns that occurred 10,000 years ago, and all of a sudden realizes they're about to happen again. He starts warning people about this and realizes that this thing is coming faster than even he expected. I mean, this is obviously somewhat connected to what science has been doing for at least 30 years now. Scientists have been saying, geologists and people who, environmental scientists, have been telling us for a while that things are not right. We are not treating the earth in a way that, makes us look smart. We are inviting our own annihilation. So at the same time, his son goes off to school, and then he realizes that his son is in danger because this is coming. And this story then has, I won't give away the ending. This story has elements of human family drama, including marriage, coupling, and generations, as we see in some of the older stories. But just to pause a little bit on the human family drama aspect, even this story, this film, tells a story that has a human interest element in it associated with the story of catastrophic disaster. And I think that's the kind of story that does work better when we think of a larger audience. One of the other things I think that does, that occurs a lot and maybe makes these stories more interesting, is a description of human relationships and what, human beings will do for others. Maybe they won't do it for their planet, but they will do it for their family. They will do it for people they care about. And there's some hope in that. We can hope that because we do love other people, or even, our pets or our cattle or whatever, we will care and we will do something. So I think the stories, in addition to the deity thing, the modern stories focus more on these, the reliance, the interdependence of humans on one another specifically. Just very quickly, people know in Norway that this thing is going to collapse. This fjord called Guy Ranger, I think, will collapse. They don't know when. And so in this movie, it has happened. And again, here it is, the response to it, the disaster response, the people, helping. There is a geologist here too, a person who knows, a scientist, but it's not he or any one individual like him that saves the world. It's people who rush to the scene and, rescue operations, etc., etc. I'm not going to talk about Evan Almighty because I think you should just watch it. Again, the other stories do similar things, but I'll talk a little bit about Waterworld. I don't know if you know it or if you remember it. So it's set in a future where polar ice caps have melted and Earth is almost entirely submerged. But that's what it is. A mutated mariner fights starvation and outlaws who, of course, become active in scenes of human disaster, pillage, rape, robbery. And the mariner reluctantly helps a woman and a young girl to try to find dry land. Again, I think these are the positive elements of the stories we are now telling. We don't have the deity, but we have each other, and we should use each other. And then finally, I'm not going to talk about Mohenjo-daro or Kedarnath because they're, negligible films. But My Name is Khan, being a Shah Rukh Khan superstar, is going to be more impactful. And in that movie, there is a long section where, in fact, this autistic Indian diasporic man goes and helps with the rescue operations after Katrina. and we see the cinematization of the actual water and the flood and people being rescued and our good old Khan, carrying things on his shoulders, but it's a message of hope. And it's also, this one is a message of transnational solidarity, which is what we need. We cannot stop climate change, as we well know, by acting within nation-state boundaries. We have all got to get together and talk about it. So I'll just end with that, and do something about it.
Sorry, I must have. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you. Really, reflected on the different factors coming up in flood films wonderfully, both of you. And I was just wondering, as you were mentioning some of the names of the films, what they show, the issues of relationships, contribution, power, different things come into question when we discuss such a huge, massive thing as a flood. And I was just wondering that the number of stories, number of in the flood stories in scriptures and say local regional folk narratives where we see, do we see as many cinematic representations of flood stories? Actually, floods lead to displacement. We have different types of displacement oriented story, like displacement from civil wars, displacement push factors being at times some other thing, maybe a partition, maybe a civil war, maybe something else, maybe there are stories of displacement based on pull factor, the diaspora stories which we get often. But you would actually I think both of you have done that research much more than I did. But I personally feel that flood has not been represented that much in films lately, where when we actually discuss that flood, the cleansing effect of flood, as Aditi wonderfully put it, her grandparents, what her grandparents used to say. In fact, when I was listening to Aditi, I remembered Bob Dylan's reference to the dove. So how many miles does the wild dove sail before it sleeps in the sand? In fact, Bob Dylan is referring to a completely different thing, a completely different social problem. But what is he referring to? The dove of the flood episode, the biblical dove that we, have
That's a
seen.
good point. Yeah.
But sorry.
That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of that.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you wanted to add up to it. So yeah, so I was just feeling, so we could have actually had many more flood films. You mentioned My Name is Khan. I'm coming to India. You mentioned My Name is Khan. You mentioned Kedarnath. You mentioned Mohenjo-daro. In fact, all of us in Bollywood is a massive industry. It has it. I really don't know how many films it produces in a year, but it's a massive number, I'm sure. And everyone, everyone has read about the Indus Valley episode, right? But we have, I'm not sure, do we have many Indus Valley films? But Indus Valley episode is a major episode that we discuss. We have stories, we have so many things, but we have one Mohenjo-daro when we refer to it. Actually, I was just wondering, I don't know, you have, I'm sure you have more stories to share with us on representations of floods in cinema.
How much time do we have? I just want to pace it so even Aditi can speak, maybe.
And yeah, I think actually we are past
Okay, then I'll just
studies,
make a
right?
quick statement, and maybe
We can,
Aditi
yeah,
will
we
make
can
one.
take a quick statement.
So I think that in the situation for Indian films, I mean Bollywood films, if that's one part of Indian cinema, but let's say Bollywood films, for convenience, I think they have other access to grind, and I think the consciousness that of the impending global disaster has yet to catch on, and I think they don't, However, there are flood stories that are not about global disaster. They're about heavy rain and flooding and displacement of people. And you're reminding me of this movie called Mother India, which was made in 1957 by Mehboob Khan. And it has a very major episode in the center of the story where, because of heavy rain, there's a flood, everything washes away in the village. And the mother is literally on a tree with her 4 kids or whatever, and nothing around, just rain and flood. But then gradually the waters subside, and then the next thing that Khan shows us, I mean, this is his story, is the villagers gathering and helping each other to clear away the debris and till the land again. So I think there are more stories like that where we get um, flooding not from environmental crisis, but from just weather related things. I think there are stories by Mrinal Sen, a Bengali director, that one film at least that is based on that is about a great flood and a river flood and people helping each other. But I think that's a really good point. Why doesn't Bollywood do more of it? As I said, I think they have more urgent issues. Indians in general are not quite there where they're thinking about. And also, natural disaster movies are not a big thing in India. I don't think they are. Do you? If you think
Is it
otherwise,
globally? Otherwise, you can.
I think we see many more in the West, like even before flood or water and displacement stories. I mean, we've had, what is that? Ah, air airport something, or towering inferno, which is very old, as a fire. But I think we have many more stories in Hollywood, at least, where there's a depiction of disaster, be it natural or not, or man-made, which suggests that maybe because it's a more the West is technologically more advanced, there has been an earlier kind of sowing of the seed of this idea that where is all this going to take us? Like, is this going to make us happy? Is technology going to save us? Which I think hasn't come to India yet. And, but in Norway, we have that story, the film called, The Wave, where there is that. So I think it is more prevalent in the West yet.
Would you consider the biblical influence on it?
In the West, yeah, I think so. I think most of these stories in Hollywood or films in Hollywood or in other Western countries, if they are about a flood, their general story structure will imitate the biblical story. So yes, and I don't know all the possible films one could talk about, but I think they are influenced by the Christian mindset is influenced by the
Yes, I was
Bible.
just.
And of course, these are, at least professedly Christian countries, so they do operate within that ideology. Yeah.
As you mentioned, it just came to my mind when you mentioned that we have more flood-based movies in the West than in
Flood
here
or
in the
some
East.
kind of major
Yeah,
disaster.
of course, that is not the only factor. I'm sure,
Mhm.
no, a single factor can't guide an industry in this way. But um, as we started the discussion with representation of flood in religious scriptures, it just came into my
Mhm.
mind that maybe the Christian influence in certain parts of the world
Mhm.
have produced more flood films, because it's not that we don't have displacement based movies in other parts. We have many Asian films has many displacement stories. Oh, in fact, if you just consider India, we don't even need the um, Iranian industry or the Korean industry. In fact, all the industries have, but here, even in everywhere, they produce many displacement stories. Um, um, but I see lesser flood-based story. That's why I just asked. Would you like to reflect on this, Aditi? If you have something to share. I just
Yeah.
feel that you have something to share.
I have grown up watching Bollywood films, and I think that's what I predominantly associate with Indian cinema. And from my understanding, you can't necessarily just blame Bollywood for this. I think it's a global thing with films. Is making sure the male protagonist finds some way to save society and makes himself look like, the holy man of all holy men. But and I think Bollywood uses things such as floods to just garner more attention towards the male protagonist, and perhaps they have just used it up too much to the point where they're, even with the recent film like Kedarnath, well, it's not super recent, but somewhat more recent than other films. The film, sure, it talked about the incredible flood, but it's still, it's if you think about it, its main focus was talking about how the male and female protagonist gave up something. We're the heroes of, the entire story. And I don't think that's just a Bollywood thing. I'm not just going to blame them. I think it's a Western thing as well. Sure, they do have more films on floods and natural disasters, but there's the same male protagonist, saves female protagonist, plus society makes himself look like a great man, And I think that's just something that's sort of carried around all nations, all cultures. And I think people, especially maybe in India, just don't find it, in Bollywood, don't find floods and natural disasters, a good enough story to portray their, their protagonists. But I think if you look at the more cultural films, more like, hidden films, you'll find that they're based on people's stories across India. And, people in India have gone through varieties of different natural disasters. Like my mom went through that horrific Gujarat earthquake sometime in the early 2000s, I believe. I'm not quite sure, but or late 1900s. But, that horrific Gujarat earthquake. Or perhaps, like I said, my family in Bihar going through floods consistently, their crops getting ruined, their agriculture getting ruined. You'll find these stories in smaller films throughout India, and the impacts that they have had on the displacement of people, on not displacement, perhaps more prevalently the impacts on their daily lives. Perhaps the internet going out, perhaps their agriculture and their crops getting ruined, perhaps schools getting flooded. They don't necessarily get displaced, but their way of life gets displaced, right? Their way of life completely shifts from what they're used to. And I think those are hidden in smaller parts of India, but when it comes to bigger industries, it's about showcasing stars, perhaps more than understanding and educating, the public about floods and climate change and those issues.
That's nice. I think this discussion otherwise can go on for hours. It is really lovely talking to both of you. Of course, we should stop for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But I just before we go, it's lovely listening to stories, sharing stories, um, but flood stories. Today's discussion, as it was on, of course, it is a calamity based on natural disaster. It's lots. It talks of human loss, but again, it talks of revival of cultures, revival of races. It talks of general invention. We have seen displacements, bringing in invention. I'm sure Professor Bhattacharya must have observed representations of the revival element in films and the positive energy that, of course, flood films reflect. We would like to actually maybe wrap up our session with your reflection on it, and then we go for today, and maybe we come back again with some other stories later.
I think I've pretty much said what I had to say, and I know we are well past time. So I would like to just thank you all for making this possible for us to have this moment to talk about stories. And I would like to say, yay for stories, more stories. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor Bhattacharya. Thank you, Aditi. It was
Thank
wonderful talking to you.
It was
And
wonderful
thank
to
you
talk to you.
all for being here with us. I think over to you, Momita.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya, Aditi, and Suchandra for joining us and such an insightful conversation. We look forward for submissions of stories, essays, and poems on displacement and rehabilitation of flood victims under TMYS review September 2021. Please stay safe, take good care of yourself. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.